footsteps and quiet conversation, the ordinary music of a busy branch on a weekday. On this particular morning, that hum had vanished entirely. Every teller, every guard, every waiting customer seemed to hold their breath at once. Because the young woman standing behind the counter was not merely an employee. She was Evelyn Brooks, the youngest chief executive officer in the history of the bank. And she was staring at a screen with an expression somewhere between disbelief and disdain. Beside her stood a man in a faded jacket, his boots scuffed, his hands calm at his sides. Evelyn let out a short, cutting laugh that echoed off the marble floor. "Only $9 left in this account," she said, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "And you think you deserve to waste this bank's time?" A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. The man in the old jacket did not flinch. He only looked at her, steady and unbothered, and asked whether her bank measured its customers by their character or only by the number on a screen. 15 minutes later, that same quiet man would sign a withdrawal order for $86 million, setting off a chain of events that would become the worst crisis in the bank's long history. His name was Lucas Carter, and he was 38 years old. He had raised his daughter alone since she was a toddler, working late nights and early mornings, so that she would never feel the absence of a second parent as a wound. Her name was Chloe, and she was now 11, sharp and curious in a way that reminded Lucas of himself before the world had taught him to guard his softer edges. Every morning before anything else, he made her breakfast himself, packed her lunch himself, and drove her to school himself, even though he could have hired a small army of people to do all of it for him. He believed that a father's presence mattered more than a father's convenience, and he had built his entire life around that single belief, arranging his empire so that it could run without him standing at its center every hour of the day. He did not care for extravagance. He drove a pickup truck that had seen better decades, wore a watch that told time and did nothing else, and preferred silence to attention. He had once owned a much finer car, purchased in his 20s during a brief and uncomfortable period when he believed success needed to be displayed to be real. And he had sold it within a year, uneasy with the way people began treating him differently the moment they saw it in a parking lot. Few people who passed him on the street would have guessed that he sat at the head of a technology company most of them used every single day, because Lucas ran his empire quietly, through a trusted team of executives, while he stayed in the background where he felt most comfortable. He believed that the loudest voice in a room was rarely the wisest one. And he had built a career and a fortune on the strength of that quiet conviction. That morning, however, he had decided to handle a matter himself. There were a few corporate fees to settle and some paperwork that needed his personal signature. And rather than send an assistant, he drove to the bank himself, dressed exactly as he always dressed, in worn boots and a jacket that had faded from years of use. He had dropped Chloe at school 20 minutes earlier, promising her he would be home in time to help with her science project, and the promise sat comfortably in his mind as he pulled into the parking lot, in no particular hurry, expecting nothing more from the morning than a short line and a stack of forms to sign. The other customers in line noticed him the way people notice anyone who looks like they are struggling. A woman near the entrance whispered to her husband that the man must be having a hard year. Someone else glanced at his shoes and looked away, embarrassed for him. A young security guard by the door watched him a beat too long. The way people sometimes do when they are quietly deciding whether a stranger belongs somewhere. Lucas heard none of it, or perhaps he heard all of it and simply did not care. Because somewhere along the way, he had learned that a person's worth was never something you could read off their clothing. He thought, sometimes, about the years before Chloe was born, when he had chased exactly the kind of validation that came from expensive things and impressed strangers, and how empty that chase had left him even as his bank balance grew. It was becoming a father that had changed him, more than any business success ever had, because raising a child alone had forced him to ask what actually mattered when nobody was watching and nothing needed to be proven. He believed, quietly and without needing to convince anyone else of it, that dignity did not depend on appearances, and that the moment a man started performing wealth for strangers was the moment he had already lost something far more valuable than money. Standing in that line, waiting his turn behind an elderly couple and a young man arguing quietly on the phone, he felt none of the impatience that seemed to ripple through everyone else in the room. He had learned, over the years, that patience was its own quiet form of strength. He stepped up to the counter when his turn came, greeted the teller politely, and handed over his documents. Her name tag read Marissa, and she smiled at him, the reflexive, tired smile of someone near the end of a long shift, before turning to her screen and beginning to type his information into the system. She asked him to confirm his account number, and he recited it from memory without needing to check his wallet. She waited for the screen to load, made small, pleasant conversation about the weather. And then, mid-sentence, her expression shifted. Right there, in small, unforgiving numbers, was his available balance, $9.13. Marissa's fingers paused over the keyboard, her polite smile faltering as she tried to decide how to proceed without embarrassing the man standing patiently in front of her. The teller's hands hovered over the keyboard as though she were not sure what to do next, and it was in that exact moment of hesitation that Evelyn Brooks happened to be walking through the lobby toward a meeting on the upper floor. She was 36 years old, brilliant by every metric the industry used to measure such things, and she had climbed to the top of Sterling National faster than anyone in the company's history, skipping rungs on the ladder that most executives spent decades trying to reach. She had grown up watching her own parents struggle financially, moving twice in her childhood because they could not keep up with rent. And she had promised herself, somewhere around the age of 15, that she would never again feel the particular powerlessness of having too little money in a world that measured everything by how much you had. That old fear had calcified over the years into something harder and less forgiving, a belief that the people who mattered were the people who had already won, and that everyone else existed somewhere on the periphery of her attention. She was, beneath the tailored suits and the confident stride, someone who had learned to equate a person's value with the size of their portfolio, because in her world, that equation had always seemed to hold. It was a belief nobody around her ever challenged, because the people closest to her at work depended on her approval for their own advancement, and it is a rare employee who corrects the judgment of the person who signs their bonus. She noticed the teller's uncertain face from several yards away, and out of habit more than curiosity, she changed direction and stepped closer to see what the trouble was. She leaned over the counter without asking permission, looked at the account details glowing on the screen, and allowed herself a small, amused smile before straightening up and speaking, deliberately, in a voice pitched to carry across the lobby rather than stay between the three of them. An account with $9 in it, and you are here trying to process a corporate transaction, she said, shaking her head as though the very idea offended her professional sensibilities. A few customers turned to look. One or two laughed under their breath, uncertain whether they were supposed to be entertained or uncomfortable. Lucas remained composed, his voice even when he answered that he simply needed to complete a transaction, nothing more. Evelyn tilted her head, unimpressed, and told him plainly that this bank existed to serve real customers, people whose accounts reflected some seriousness of purpose. The air in the lobby thickened, the kind of tension that makes strangers suddenly very interested in their phones or the floor tiles, anything but eye contact. Evelyn was not finished. Having found what she believed was an easy target, she seemed almost energized by it. The way some people are energized by cruelty when they mistake it for wit. She told him that a man like him was worth exactly $9 in this building, that he was wasting valuable time that could be spent on customers who actually mattered, that this was a financial institution and not a charity. She asked, with mock sincerity, whether he had wandered in looking for the shelter down the block by mistake, and a fresh wave of nervous laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered near the counters, half of them customers who had stopped pretending not to watch. A few employees near the back exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with how far their CEO was taking the moment, while a couple of others, eager to be seen agreeing with the woman who controlled their careers, offered polite laughter they did not entirely feel. Lucas listened to all of it without raising his voice, without so much as shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and something in his stillness seemed to unsettle Evelyn more than any protest would have. When she finished, he asked her quietly whether she believed this was how a chief executive ought to treat the people who walked through her doors, regardless of what a screen happened to display on any given morning. Evelyn answered without hesitation that she was simply telling the truth as she saw it. That a bank had every right to prioritize customers whose accounts justified the effort, and that sentiment had no place in a business built on numbers. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he has already solved, but is still curious to watch unfold. He told her, in the same even tone he had used the entire time, that numbers on a screen changed by the hour, but the way a person treated a stranger revealed something that did not change nearly so quickly. Evelyn waved a hand dismissively, unwilling to entertain what sounded to her like a lecture from a man she had already decided did not warrant her patience. A junior employee near the counter, a young man who had only worked at the branch for a few months, tried quietly to intervene, whispering to Evelyn that perhaps this conversation should continue somewhere more private. Evelyn waved him off without even looking in his direction, too caught up in the momentum of her own performance to notice that most of the lobby had gone completely silent, watching now not with amusement, but with the particular discomfort of witnesses who sense a situation has gone too far and do not know how to stop it. An elderly woman near the entrance, waiting for her own appointment, shook her head slowly and murmured to no one in particular that she had never seen a bank treat a customer this way in 40 years of coming to that same branch. Lucas nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has heard everything he needs to hear and has already decided what comes next. He said only the word fine, calm and final, with no heat behind it at all, and reached into his jacket for his phone. He dialed a number, held the phone to his ear, and waited, unbothered by the eyes still fixed on him from every direction. Nobody in that lobby, least of all Evelyn Brooks, had any idea that the call he was making would begin to unravel everything she had built her identity around. What none of them could have known, standing there in that marble lobby under the fluorescent lights, was the truth sitting quietly behind that $9 balance. Lucas was not poor. In fact, in the days leading up to that morning, he had been in the process of moving significant portions of his wealth into a series of investment vehicles, shifting capital into trust accounts designed to protect his daughter's future, and finalizing a long-planned restructuring of his financial holdings. The checking account the teller had pulled up happened to be the one he used for small personal errands, the account that paid for groceries and gas and the occasional dinner out. And it was, by pure coincidence of timing, sitting nearly empty because he had just completed a major transfer the day before. His actual net worth ran into the hundreds of millions. The corporate reserve fund connected to his company alone held $86 million, money earmarked for expansion, for research, for the kind of long-term projects that required patient capital and careful planning, money that Lucas had spent years accumulating precisely so that the company would never have to depend on outside lenders during difficult seasons. He had grown up watching his own parents struggle under the weight of borrowed money, watching creditors call the house at dinner time, and he had promised himself that whatever he built would never leave the people depending on it exposed to that same kind of fear. That fund was not a symbol of excess to him. It was a form of protection, built slowly and deliberately, for every employee whose paycheck depended on the company's ability to weather a difficult quarter without panic. Lucas was, in fact, the founder of that very technology company, though almost nobody recognized his face, because he had spent years deliberately staying out of interviews and public appearances, preferring to let his leadership team represent the brand, while he focused on building rather than performing. He had started the company from a rented room above a hardware store more than 15 years earlier, writing code through the night while working a day job to keep the lights on, and he had never quite lost the instinct to stay small and unnoticed, even after the company grew into something enormous. He served as chairman, and, more importantly, he held controlling ownership. The kind of stake that meant when he made a decision, there was no board of skeptics to slow him down, no committee that needed convincing before action could be taken. The person on the other end of his phone call was his chief financial officer, a woman named Diane Foster, who had worked with him for over a decade and had learned never to question the calm certainty in his voice, because in 10 years, she had never once seen that calm certainty lead him astray. She answered on the second ring, already halfway through a different meeting, and something in the tone of his greeting told her to excuse herself from the room. Lucas told her, plainly, to prepare the full transfer of the reserve fund, effective immediately. There was a pause on the line, long enough that he could hear her stepping into an empty hallway. And Diane asked whether he truly meant the entire amount, all 86 million, moved out of Sterling National in one transaction. Lucas answered simply that he did, and added that he would explain the reasoning when he saw her later that afternoon, though in truth there was very little to explain beyond what had just happened in the lobby. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket as though he had just ordered a cup of coffee rather than set $86 million into motion, and turned his attention back to the counter where the teller was still waiting, unsure what to do with the man she had just watched calmly reroute a fortune. He asked the teller, politely, whether he could speak with the branch manager. Word moved quickly through the back offices, and within minutes a manager appeared, a middle-aged man named Gerald Ashford, flustered and apologetic in the particular way that bank employees become when they sense something is deeply wrong and cannot yet identify what. Lucas handed over a folder of documents, his identification, his account records, the paperwork tied to his corporate holdings, laid out in the same unhurried manner he might have used to hand over a grocery list. Gerald began verifying the information at his desk, entering account numbers into a system that pulled up records most branch employees never had reason to see, and with each pass, the color slowly drained from his face. He looked up at Lucas once, then back at the screen, then up again, as though needing a second confirmation that his eyes were not deceiving him. He was looking, in real time, at proof that the man in the worn jacket controlled one of the largest reserve funds the bank currently held, a figure so far beyond ordinary that Gerald found himself briefly unable to speak. This was not a small account holder having a bad morning. This was one of Sterling National's most significant clients, quietly hiding in plain sight for years, filing routine paperwork like anyone else, and he had just been humiliated in front of an entire lobby of witnesses by the very institution meant to serve him. Gerald cleared his throat, straightened his tie without quite meaning to, and asked, in a voice noticeably more careful than before, how he could be of assistance to Lucas today. Lucas signed the withdrawal authorization without any drama, his handwriting steady, the number written out in full beside his signature, $86 million. The pen barely made a sound against the paper, and yet it felt to everyone watching as though something enormous had just shifted in the room. The employees near the counter fell into stunned silence, glancing at one another as though checking whether their colleagues had witnessed the same impossible scene. And the manager, hands trembling slightly, excused himself and hurried toward his office to call Evelyn directly, unwilling to trust something this significant to email or a message passed through someone else. Evelyn, still upstairs and still riding the small satisfaction of her earlier performance, assumed at first that this had to be some kind of exaggeration, perhaps a misunderstanding, or an attempt by an embarrassed man to save face by inventing a story too large to challenge. She told the manager, with a trace of impatience, that he was likely being played, that people sometimes claimed extraordinary things when they had just been caught in an uncomfortable position. But when the documents were sent up to her office, and she saw Shastor, with her own eyes, scrolling slowly through years of transactions, corporate filings, and a controlling ownership stake tied to a company whose products sat on her own phone, the confidence drained from her expression entirely. It was replaced by something colder and far more frightening, the slow dawning recognition that she had just insulted, in front of dozens of witnesses and at least one working security camera, one of the wealthiest clients the bank had ever served. She sat very still at her desk for a long moment, the folder open in front of her, unable to decide which part of the situation to address first. The consequences did not stop at $86 million, because Lucas was not finished. Within the hour, he placed calls to several of his closest business partners, to investors who had trusted him for years, and to the heads of funds affiliated with his company. He did not ask anyone to do anything. He simply mentioned, in passing, that he had decided to move his banking relationship elsewhere. He offered no explanation beyond that single sentence, and he did not need to offer more, because the people who knew him understood exactly what that sentence meant. Word spread through those closed circles the way water finds every crack in a foundation, quiet, relentless, and impossible to stop once it begins moving. By the end of that single business day, dozens of businesses connected to Lucas's network had begun transferring their accounts away from Sterling National. A logistics company that had banked there for 18 years moved its entire operating account within hours. A regional supplier who had never once been late on a payment closed 3 separate lines of credit without explanation, offering only a brief, polite note, thanking the branch for years of service. A smaller software firm, whose founder had once mentored under Lucas early in his career, followed without needing to be asked twice, simply because loyalty, in that particular circle, ran in one direction, and it pointed toward the man who had built something out of nothing and never forgotten where he came from. The bank's internal finance department flagged an alarming spike in outgoing transfers before the lunch hour had even passed. Numbers that made no sense against any normal pattern of customer behavior. Analysts were called in from other departments to help make sense of the pattern. Emergency meetings were scheduled and then rescheduled as the numbers kept climbing throughout the afternoon. Somewhere in the building, executives who had spent their careers building relationships with major clients watched, helpless, as those same relationships began quietly dissolving, one phone call at a time, without anyone from those departing accounts ever raising their voice or filing a formal complaint. Nobody needed to complain. Nobody needed to explain. It was the kind of exodus that could not be stopped through apology or damage control, because it was not driven by anger. It was driven by trust that had simply evaporated. And trust, once gone, rarely announces its return the way anger does. It simply leaves, quietly, and does not come back. The financial markets noticed within days. Sterling National's stock price began to slide, as analysts and journalists started asking pointed questions about the sudden wave of withdrawals, questions the communications department struggled to answer without revealing the actual cause. Reporters who covered the banking sector picked up on rumors circulating among insiders, rumors about a very public incident in the main branch lobby, about a CEO who had mocked a customer's balance without knowing who he truly was. The story spread quickly among people who worked in finance, passed from one trading floor to another. The kind of cautionary tale that gets repeated in hushed tones at industry conferences for years afterward, always ending with the same disbelieving shake of the head. By the end of the week, a financial columnist had written a short piece about the mysterious wave of withdrawals hitting Sterling National, careful with names, but pointed enough in its implications that anyone inside the company understood exactly what had happened. The piece was picked up and reprinted by a handful of other outlets covering the banking industry, each version adding slightly more detail as former employees, speaking only on condition of anonymity, confirmed pieces of what had happened in the lobby that morning. None of the coverage named Lucas directly, respecting the same quiet boundary he had maintained around his identity for years. But within financial circles, it did not take long for people to connect the incident to the man whose company appeared on nearly every phone and laptop in the country. Customers who had banked with Sterling National for years began asking their own account managers pointed questions, wanting reassurance that they, too, would not be judged by whatever number happened to appear on a screen during a routine visit. Employee morale inside the bank suffered as well, with many staff members privately admitting they had always found Evelyn's manner toward certain customers uncomfortable, but had never felt safe enough in their positions to say so aloud until the consequences became impossible to ignore. The board of directors, watching their institution's reputation and share price both take a hit within the same week, called an emergency session and summoned Evelyn Brooks to explain herself. She walked into that boardroom already, knowing there was no version of events she could spin in her favor. Security footage from the lobby had already been reviewed by legal counsel. Witness statements from employees who had been standing at the counter that morning had already been collected and cross-referenced. Every detail was accounted for, time-stamped and undeniable, laid out across the long table in a folder thick enough that nobody bothered opening it a second time. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind, no alternate explanation that might soften what had actually happened. One of the board members, an older man named Harold Whitfield, who had sat on that panel for over 20 years, and had seen every kind of executive crisis the industry could produce, looked directly at her and asked whether she had truly humiliated a customer in front of an entire lobby, simply because of what appeared on a screen for a single moment. Another board member, a woman who had championed Evelyn's promotion just 2 years earlier, asked quietly whether she understood that the institution's entire business model rested on the promise that every customer, regardless of appearance or balance, would be treated with basic respect. Evelyn said nothing for a long moment, staring at the folder in front of her rather than at the faces around the table. It was, in some strange way, the first time she had truly understood the size of what she had done, not as an abstract public relations problem to be managed with a statement and a smile, but as a real failure of judgment that had cost the institution everything it claimed to stand for, and had cost her, quite possibly, everything she had spent her career building. She left that meeting different than she had entered it, and within days she sought out Lucas Carter directly, arriving without the confidence that had defined her only a week earlier. The arrogance was gone from her posture, replaced by something far more uncertain. She apologized, plainly and without excuses, admitting that she had judged him by his appearance, and had been wrong to do so in every possible way. Lucas listened patiently, the way he listened to everyone, without interrupting, and without letting his expression give away what he was thinking. When she finished, he told her, gently but firmly, that he had not withdrawn his money because his feelings were hurt. Evelyn looked at him, confused, waiting for him to explain further. He said that he had moved his funds because her bank had proven, in that single moment in the lobby, that it did not respect the people who walked through its doors, regardless of what those people's accounts happened to show. It was not about revenge, and it was certainly not about pride. It was about the simple fact that an institution built on trust had shown him, clearly and publicly, that trust was not something it actually valued. The words landed harder than any accusation could have, because there was no anger in them, only a kind of quiet clarity that left Evelyn with nothing to push back against. She had expected fury, maybe even threats, something she could respond to with a defense or a counterargument. Instead, she was left holding a truth she could not argue with, one that made her earlier cruelty feel even smaller and more indefensible than before. She left that meeting different than she had entered it, and within days she sought out Lucas Carter directly, arriving at his office without an appointment and without the confidence that had defined her only a week earlier. The arrogance was gone from her posture, replaced by something far more uncertain, something almost fragile in a way that would have surprised anyone who had only ever seen her command a room. His assistant hesitated before letting her in, but Lucas, when he heard who was waiting, simply nodded and told her to send Evelyn through. Evelyn sat across from him and apologized, plainly and without excuses, admitting that she had judged him by his appearance and had been wrong to do so in every possible way. She told him that she had spent the last several nights replaying the moment in the lobby over and over, hearing her own words in a voice that no longer sounded like someone she wanted to be. Lucas listened patiently, the way he listened to everyone, without interrupting and without letting his expression give away what he was thinking. When she finished, he told her, gently but firmly, that he had not withdrawn his money because his feelings were hurt. Evelyn looked at him, confused, waiting for him to explain further, because in her mind the entire episode had always been about the sting of public humiliation, about a wound to his pride that he had answered with an even larger wound to hers. He said that he had moved his funds because her bank had proven, in that single moment in the lobby, that it did not respect the people who walked through its doors, regardless of what those people's accounts happened to show. It was not about revenge, and it was certainly not about pride. It was about the simple fact that an institution built on trust had shown him, clearly and publicly, that trust was not something it actually valued, and once he had seen that clearly, staying would have meant pretending he had not. The words landed harder than any accusation could have, because there was no anger in them, only a kind of quiet clarity that left Evelyn with nothing to push back against. She had expected fury, maybe even threats, something she could respond to with a defense or a counter-argument, some version of conflict she knew how to navigate. Instead, she was left holding a truth she could not argue with, one that made her earlier cruelty feel even smaller and more indefensible than before. She asked him, quietly, whether there was anything she could do to make it right, and Lucas told her that the most useful thing she could do was remember this feeling the next time she was tempted to judge someone by what she could see, rather than what she could not. In the days that followed, Lucas walked into a different bank across town, one that had no idea who he was, and no reason to treat him as anything other than an ordinary customer. He wore the same jacket, the same boots, and carried the same quiet manner he always did, because none of what had happened at Sterling National had changed anything about who he actually was. The staff at the front desk greeted him warmly regardless, offering him a seat, a glass of water, and patient guidance through the paperwork he needed filed. A young man named Tobias walked him through the account opening process, step by step, asking thoughtful questions about what Lucas actually needed, rather than what package might earn the branch the largest commission, and at no point did his tone shift or his patience thin, even when the process took longer than either of them expected. Nobody there knew about the $86 million sitting behind his modest appearance. And it did not matter to them, because they treated every person who walked through their doors with the same basic decency, the kind that did not depend on a screen or a suit or a car in the parking lot. Only after his identity was verified through the standard account opening process, and the numbers behind his name began appearing on Tobias's screen, did the branch realize the scale of what had just walked in through their front entrance. Tobias, to his credit, did not change his manner even then, though his eyes widened slightly before he composed himself and continued exactly as he had before. Within the hour, senior leadership from that bank arrived personally to welcome him. Having heard from Tobias's supervisor that something unusual was unfolding at his desk, the regional director of that bank, a woman named Patricia Newen, who had spent nearly 30 years working her way up from a teller position much like the one Tobias now held, sat with Lucas personally for over an hour, asking not about numbers, but about what he actually wanted his relationship with a financial institution to look like going forward. She told him, candidly, that she had heard fragments of what happened at Sterling National, and that she wanted him to know her branch trained every employee, from the newest hire to the most senior officer, to treat every person who walked through the door as though they might one day turn out to be exactly the kind of client Lucas was, or simply as though they deserved that treatment, regardless of whether they ever did. Lucas told them plainly that he had not chosen their institution because of any special rate or exclusive perk they might offer him. He had chosen them because they had been kind to him before they ever knew what he was worth on paper. And that distinction mattered to him more than any interest rate ever could. Patricia nodded, understanding immediately, and promised him that nothing about how the branch treated him would change now that they knew who he was, because nothing about how they treated anyone was ever supposed to depend on that information in the first place. The two sides moved quickly to formalize a new banking relationship, and the full $86 million, along with the accounts of many of his associates who had followed his lead in the days after the incident, found a new and lasting home. Back at Sterling National, the fallout continued to settle for months afterward, longer than anyone in leadership had initially expected. The board reached its final decision after weeks of internal review, careful legal consultation, and mounting pressure from shareholders who wanted the matter resolved before it caused further damage, and Evelyn Brooks was removed from her position as chief executive officer. She did not fight the decision publicly, did not hire a lawyer to contest it, and did not give any interviews trying to reframe what had happened. In private, to the few colleagues who still spoke with her afterward, she admitted that she understood exactly why it had to happen. Even if understanding did not make the loss any easier to carry, she cleared out her office alone on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when no one else would be around to watch, packing years of awards and framed certificates into cardboard boxes that felt strangely light for everything they had once represented to her. Walking out through the same lobby where the entire incident had begun, she paused for a moment near the counter where Lucas had once stood, and for the first time, she let herself feel the full weight of what her own voice had sounded like that morning, echoing off marble she would probably never walk across again. The story became something of a case study across the industry, discussed in business schools and executive training seminars as a lesson in what happens when leadership forgets that respect cannot be rationed out based on appearances or account balances. Professors used it to illustrate how quickly trust could unravel an institution that had taken generations to build, and how little control even a powerful executive had once that unraveling began. Lucas never sought further punishment for her. He gave no interviews condemning her publicly, made no statements to reporters eager for a dramatic quote, and never mentioned her name again in any public setting, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because he had never believed that dragging someone further down made anything better for anyone involved. He simply returned to running his company. Quietly, the way he always had. Letting the consequences of that single morning speak for themselves, without any need for him to add commentary. Months later, Evelyn found work at a much smaller institution, starting well below where she had once stood, and those who crossed paths with her there noticed a difference almost immediately. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions of tellers and junior staff that she would never have thought to ask before. And she made a quiet habit of thanking employees by name, remembering small details about their lives that she once would have considered beneath her attention. Nobody ever announced the change publicly. And she never spoke of the lobby, or the withdrawal, or the boardroom where her career had ended, but the people who worked alongside her sensed that something fundamental had shifted in how she saw the people around her. Lucas, for his part, went home that evening the same way he always did, stopping to pick up Chloe from her after-school program and listening, with his full attention, as she described in exhaustive detail the science project she had been working on for weeks. He never mentioned the events of that morning to her, not because he was hiding anything, but because he did not consider it the kind of story worth centering his life around. What he wanted her to remember, if she remembered anything about how he had built the life they shared, was not the size of any number he had once moved through a bank on a difficult morning, but the version of him that came home every single night to make sure she never doubted, for even a moment, that she was the most important thing he had built. What remained, long after the headlines faded, and the story became just another cautionary tale traded among bankers and executives at industry conferences, was a simple truth that outlasted every number involved. A balance on a screen reflects only the state of an account at a single moment in time. It says nothing about the character of the person standing behind it, nothing about what they have built, what they have sacrificed, or what they still might become. A business can lose millions in a single afternoon because of one poor decision, and it can often recover, given enough time and the right leadership willing to learn from what went wrong. But the trust of the people it serves, once broken in full view of a crowded room, is a currency that no amount of money can ever fully buy back, and no title, however impressive, can ever fully replace.